Germany did exactly what every military textbook said would stop an invasion. They destroyed every bridge across the Rhine. What they didn't realize was that destruction only works when your enemy needs what you destroyed, and the Americans didn't. They crossed Germany's last defensive river faster than it could be blown apart, not with genius or firepower, but with something far more dangerous: speed. If you want to understand how wars are really won not by heroics, but by systems, support this channel with a like. Subscribe to uncover the hidden mechanics that changed World War II. By early March 1945, Germany was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for delay. The Allied armies had broken out of Normandy, crossed France, shattered the Siegfried Line, and reached the western edge of the Reich itself. Tanks, trucks, artillery, and entire divisions pressed eastward with relentless momentum. What stood between them and Germany's industrial heartland was not another army, but a river, the Rhine. For centuries, the Rhine had functioned as more than geography. It was a psychological boundary, a cultural border, and in wartime, a defensive wall. Wide, fast-moving, cold, and unforgiving, the river cut across western Germany like a natural moat. In military theory, it was the kind of obstacle that slowed armies, bought time, and forced costly, deliberate crossings. German planners understood this better than anyone, and by 1945, they believed the Rhine offered one final, decisive advantage. If the bridges were gone, the Allies would have to stop. Not briefly, not tactically, but for weeks. German doctrine was built on a simple and historically proven equation. Large armies cannot cross major rivers without bridges. Destroy the bridges, and you don't need to defeat the enemy, you only need to delay him. Delay creates time. Time allows regrouping. Regrouping allows counterattacks, new defensive lines, or at the very least, a more controlled collapse. That logic had worked before. Throughout the war, bridge demolition had been one of Germany's most reliable defensive tools. From Russia to Italy, from France to the Low Countries, blown bridges forced attackers to pause, replan, and expose themselves, while engineers labored under fire to rebuild crossings. Rivers were supposed to be choke points. Bridges were supposed to be irreplaceable. So when German forces began withdrawing toward the Rhine in early 1945, the plan seemed obvious. Destroy everything: stone bridges, steel spans, rail crossings, roadways. Permanent infrastructure that had taken decades to build would be reduced to rubble in minutes. The river would remain, the crossings would vanish, and the Allies, no matter how powerful, would be forced to stop at the water's edge. By March 1st, only a handful of Rhine bridges were still standing. By March 9th, almost none remained. From Cologne to Bonn, from Mainz to Wesel, demolition charges detonated in precise sequence. Bridges collapsed into the current, steel twisted, masonry vanished beneath cold water. German engineers executed the plan with grim efficiency. In theory, it was flawless. Field Marshal Walter Model and the commanders of Army Group B believed the Rhine would buy them time measured in weeks, possibly months. Enough time to reorganize shattered units. Enough time to strengthen defenses east of the river. Enough time to make the final battles inside Germany slower, bloodier, and more costly for the attackers. It was not optimism. It was calculation. The Germans understood the scale of Allied logistics. They understood that armored divisions required constant supply. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts. None of it could cross a river at scale without bridges. Amphibious assaults could establish footholds, but not sustain armies. Temporary ferries could move men, not mechanized war. Or so the assumption went. What German planners did not question was the nature of the bridges themselves. They assumed that bridges were singular objects, fixed structures that, once destroyed, required time, safety, and heavy construction to replace. They assumed rebuilding meant engineers pouring concrete, erecting steel, and working under conditions that made speed impossible. They assumed that bridge building was civil engineering. That assumption was the foundation of their entire defensive strategy, and it was already obsolete. By 1945, the Allies, particularly the Americans, were no longer thinking about bridges as permanent structures. They were thinking about them as consumable components, temporary, modular, replaceable. To the German command, a destroyed bridge represented absence. To the Americans, it represented opportunity. The Rhine, in German calculations, was a barrier. In American planning, it was simply a wide construction site. The German plan depended on a single, fragile belief that destruction was faster than creation, that blowing up infrastructure would always take less time than building it, that the enemy would be forced to react on Germany's terms. But war had changed. Industrial war had changed the mathematics. By the spring of 1945, American doctrine no longer asked how to preserve bridges. It asked how fast new ones could be assembled. It no longer focused on defending crossings. It focused on replacing them again and again faster than the enemy could respond. Germany destroyed bridges to slow the war. America prepared to cross rivers without needing them. The Rhine was supposed to be the last defensive line of the Reich. Instead, it would become the place where an old assumption collapsed. Because within days of the final demolitions, Allied vehicles were already rolling toward the riverbanks not to wait, but to build. And what followed would prove that destroying every bridge across the Rhine did not stop the invasion. It only revealed a deeper mistake. Germany had planned for a war of denial. America had prepared for a war of replacement. On paper, Germany's plan was not desperate. It was rational. For centuries, rivers had shaped the outcome of wars not because they killed soldiers, but because they slowed armies. A river crossing forced an attacker to pause, concentrate forces, expose engineers, and commit to a predictable location. Every military academy taught the same principle. Major rivers favored the defender. The Rhine was the ultimate example. It was wide enough to prevent quick improvisation, deep enough to defeat shallow crossings, and fast enough to punish mistakes. In many places, its banks rose sharply, limiting access points and forcing attackers into narrow corridors. Even in peacetime, the Rhine was not easily tamed. In war, under fire, it was supposed to be decisive. German commanders believed that once the bridges were gone, the river would do the rest. Their reasoning followed a clear sequence. First, destroying permanent bridges eliminated the only crossings capable of supporting heavy traffic. Tanks, artillery, fuel convoys, and supply trucks required stable, load-bearing structures. Without bridges, mechanized armies stalled. Infantry could cross in boats, but armies could not fight on infantry alone. Second, reconstruction took time. Traditional bridge building required foundations, alignment, heavy equipment, and protection. Engineers working under artillery fire could not rush concrete curing or steel assembly. Even temporary military bridges were assumed to take days, not hours. Third, time created leverage. Every day the Allies were delayed at the Rhine was a day German forces could withdraw, regroup, or dig in. Even a short delay could turn a rapid advance into a grinding battle inside Germany itself. This logic had history on its side. In World War I, river crossings had bogged down offensives for weeks. In World War II, the Germans themselves had relied on destroyed bridges to slow Soviet advances in the east. The principle was not theoretical, it had been proven repeatedly. And by March 1945, the Germans believed the Allies were facing the same immutable constraints. But the plan rested on one hidden assumption, that bridges were rare, fragile, and slow to replace. That assumption no longer held. By the final year of the war, the American Army did not view bridges as singular engineering projects. It viewed them as standardized products, not monuments, but modules. Not infrastructure, but inventory. This distinction mattered. Germany destroyed bridges as if they were irreplaceable. America treated bridges as expendable. The difference came from industrial thinking. American planners had spent years preparing for a war defined by movement. They had watched armies stall not because of enemy resistance, but because supply lines collapsed. They had seen tanks outrun fuel, infantry outrun artillery, and entire offensives pause at rivers and canals. The lesson was simple. Speed only mattered if logistics could keep up. So instead of designing bridges to last, American engineers designed bridges to arrive. They asked different questions. Not, how strong can this bridge be? But, how fast can it be assembled? Not, how long will it last? But, how easily can it be replaced? This shift in thinking broke the German equation. The Germans believed destruction was a one-time act. Blow the bridge, and the problem was solved. But destruction only works if rebuilding is slower than demolition. If rebuilding becomes faster, destruction loses its value. And that was exactly what happened. American bridging doctrine assumed bridges would be damaged, targeted, and destroyed. It did not attempt to prevent that. Instead, it planned for continuous replacement. Bridges were meant to be built, used, damaged, repaired, and rebuilt again, sometimes in the same location, sometimes somewhere else entirely. From the German perspective, this was incomprehensible. Their strategy assumed scarcity, limited materials, limited transport, limited manpower. Every destroyed bridge forced the enemy to invest enormous effort to recover. American strategy assumed abundance. Abundant trucks, abundant materials, abundant trained engineers, abundant time measured in hours, not weeks. This abundance changed the rhythm of war. Where German planners imagined a single crossing point that could be targeted, American planners envisioned multiple crossings appearing simultaneously. Germany focused artillery on known bridge sites. American engineers shifted locations, altered approaches, and built where the enemy did not expect. The Rhine was not just wide, it was long, and that length worked against the defender. A river hundreds of miles long offered countless potential crossing points. Destroying fixed bridges removed obvious targets, but it also removed predictability. Without permanent structures, every stretch of riverbank became a candidate for crossing. The German plan required concentration. The American response thrived on dispersion. This was the deeper flaw in the strategy of destruction. By eliminating permanent bridges, Germany forced the Allies to rely on temporary solutions. But temporary solutions were lighter, faster, and more flexible. They did not need prepared foundations. They did not need to last. They only needed to work long enough for the next wave to cross. Once that wave crossed, the strategic balance shifted permanently. A bridge did not need to survive a war. It only needed to survive a day. German doctrine had been built around denying permanence. American doctrine had evolved to exploit impermanence. And the faster the Germans destroyed infrastructure, the more they revealed their own misunderstanding of modern war. They believed that if the Allies could not use Germany's bridges, they would be stopped. They never considered that the Allies might not want them at all. What looked like defensive brilliance was actually strategic blindness. Because destruction assumes that the enemy is dependent on what you destroy. It assumes shared constraints. It assumes that both sides are playing the same game, with the same rules. By 1945, they were not. Germany was still fighting a war where slowing construction mattered. America was fighting a war where construction itself had become a weapon. The Rhine was supposed to delay the invasion. Instead, it exposed the gap between two different eras of warfare. One side believed time was gained by denial. The other had learned how to erase denial with speed. The bridges were gone. The river remained. And the moment the first vehicles reached the water's edge, it became clear that the old logic no longer applied. Because the Allies were not asking how to cross the Rhine, they were asking how many times they could cross it before the enemy could react. At some point in every war, strategy stops being about intent and becomes about arithmetic. By March 1945, the German plan to defend the Rhine was no longer a question of courage, doctrine, or resolve. It was a question of time. How long could destruction delay an enemy who refused to slow down? The German answer was clear: long enough. The American answer was simpler: not at all. The moment Allied engineers reached the riverbanks, the conflict over the Rhine stopped being a battle of firepower and became a race. Not a race between soldiers, but a race between two opposing clocks. On one side was the German clock. Every bridge destroyed took minutes. Every demolition required a known location. Every explosion revealed artillery positions and consumed scarce ammunition. German forces could destroy infrastructure quickly, but only one structure at a time. On the other side was the American clock. Bridges could be assembled in parallel. Multiple crossings could begin simultaneously. Construction could continue even under fire. And most critically, destruction did not stop construction, it merely redirected it. This was the moment when the mathematics of war began to collapse. German planners had assumed a linear equation: one destroyed bridge equals one delayed crossing. But that equation only worked if the enemy required that specific bridge. Once bridges became modular and temporary, the relationship changed. Destruction was no longer a solution. It became a stimulus. Each destroyed bridge forced the Allies to do something the Germans could not easily counter: build elsewhere, faster. The Rhine was long, irregular, and unpredictable. Without permanent bridges dictating crossing points, the defender lost control of geography. The river stopped being a wall and became an open problem with dozens of answers. This is where speed entered the war as a weapon. Not speed in the sense of fast vehicles or rapid assaults, but speed in construction, speed in replacement, speed in recovery. American engineering units were not racing to protect bridges. They were racing to finish them before the enemy could react. And once a bridge was operational, even briefly, the strategic balance shifted irreversibly. A single successful crossing meant more artillery on the far bank. More artillery meant suppressed enemy fire. Suppressed fire meant faster construction of the next bridge. The system fed itself. German artillery crews faced an impossible choice: focus on the bridge under construction and allow another crossing to proceed elsewhere, or divide fire and fail everywhere at once. Air attacks faced similar constraints. Bombing temporary structures required precision, timing, and luck. And even successful strikes often achieved only partial damage. Because these bridges were not designed to fail catastrophically. They bent, they sagged, they absorbed damage. And when sections failed, they were replaced. The Germans were fighting a battle of interruption. The Americans were fighting a battle of continuity. This difference in approach created a feedback loop the Germans could not break. Every hour that passed without stopping, construction increased Allied capacity on the East Bank. Every vehicle that crossed made the next crossing easier. The race was already lost before it was fully understood. German strategy assumed that slowing the enemy was enough. But slowing only works if the enemy is constrained by the same limitations as the defender. The Americans were not. They were not limited by unique equipment. They were not limited by specialized labor. They were not limited by scarcity. They were limited only by time, and time was exactly what they had optimized. The key insight was brutal in its simplicity. If something can be replaced faster than it can be destroyed, then destroying it becomes pointless. Germany could destroy bridges faster than it could build them. America could build bridges faster than Germany could destroy them. That single inequality decided the Rhine. The river did not stop the invasion because the river was no longer the obstacle. The obstacle had become reaction time, and reaction time favored the attacker. Every German response followed a familiar pattern. A bridge appeared, artillery fired, aircraft attacked, damage was inflicted, engineers repaired or rebuilt, traffic resumed. Meanwhile, another bridge appeared somewhere else. Germans faced was not a single crossing but a system designed to absorb loss without slowing down. This was not improvisation. It was doctrine. American military engineering doctrine by 1945 assumed that casualties and losses were inevitable. It did not attempt to prevent them at all costs. Instead, it planned to outpace them. Engineers were trained to continue construction under fire. Damaged equipment was swapped out. Wounded men were replaced. Work did not stop. From a human perspective, this was brutal. From a strategic perspective, it was unstoppable. The German approach was built around denial. Deny crossings, deny speed, deny access. But denial fails when the enemy does not need permission. When the enemy can create access, wherever and whenever he chooses. The Rhine crossings demonstrated something deeper than engineering success. They revealed a fundamental shift in how wars were decided. War was no longer a contest between fortifications and assaults. It was a contest between production and interruption. And production was winning. German forces were still thinking in terms of objectives. Hold this river, destroy that bridge, delay this army. But the Americans were thinking in terms of throughput. How many vehicles per hour? How many crossings per day? how quickly losses could be absorbed and replaced. This difference made traditional defensive thinking obsolete. You cannot defend against something that does not need to stop. By the time German commanders realized what was happening, the process was already irreversible. Each successful crossing multiplied the problem. The more bridges that existed, the harder it became to stop any of them. The more vehicles crossed, the less effective localized destruction became. The Rhine did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was wide. Wide enough to allow multiple solutions. Wide enough to overwhelm a defender dependent on singular answers. This was the moment when the old logic of warfare failed. Germany destroyed bridges, expecting the Allies to wait. The Allies arrived, expecting to build. The Germans assumed bridges were endpoints. The Americans treated them as steps. And once speed replaced permanence as the decisive factor, the outcome ceased to be in doubt. The Rhine was no longer Germany's last defensive river. It had become a test case, a demonstration of what happens when industrial capacity meets tactical deployment, when systems designed for replacement confront strategies designed for denial. The moment the first bridge stood, no matter how briefly the mathematics broke, and from that moment on, the question was no longer whether the Allies could cross the Rhine. The question was how many times they would cross it before the war ended. Attempting to explain what happened at the Rhine as a story of heroism. Men working under fire. Engineers building bridges while artillery shells landed nearby. Units refusing to stop despite casualties. Those stories are true. But they are not the reason the crossing succeeded. If courage had been the decisive factor, Germany would not have lost. German soldiers fought with determination to the very end. If bravery alone could win wars, the Rhine would have held. What defeated Germany was not individual heroism. It was replacement. The American system was not designed to rely on exceptional people. It was designed to function with ordinary ones so long as there were enough of them, properly trained and continuously supplied. This distinction mattered more than any tactical decision. German military culture placed enormous emphasis on expertise, skilled engineers, specialized units, carefully prepared defenses. Losses in trained personnel were difficult to replace. Equipment was precious. Infrastructure, once destroyed, represented months of lost effort. American military culture assumed the opposite. Loss was expected. Damage was inevitable. Personnel and equipment were inputs, not irreplaceable assets. The system was built to keep moving, even as parts of it broke. This was not callousness. It was industrial logic. Speed, in this context, was not about working faster. It was about designing a process that never needed to stop. American bridging operations along the Rhine were organized like production lines. Tasks were divided, crews specialized, equipment flowed forward continuously. If one element failed, another took its place. If a section was damaged, it was removed and replaced while traffic continued elsewhere. Nothing in the process depended on perfection. Everything depended on continuity. German attempts to disrupt this system consistently misunderstood its nature. Artillery fire damaged components, but components were not the system. Air attacks destroyed sections, but sections were interchangeable. Even casualties, tragic as they were, did not halt operations because replacements were already en route. The system did not pause to mourn. It absorbed loss and continued. This is the most uncomfortable truth of the Rhine crossings. They were not won because American engineers were braver or smarter. They were won because the system they operated inside was indifferent to individual failure. German defenses were built around the idea of decisive interruption. Destroy the bridge, kill the engineers, force the enemy to start over. That logic only works when starting over is expensive. For the Americans, starting over was routine. A damaged bridge was not a setback. It was a maintenance issue. A destroyed section was not a defeat. It was a scheduling problem. The emphasis was never on saving a specific bridge. It was on maintaining flow. Flow of vehicles, flow of supplies, flow of pressure. Once flow was established, the strategic outcome followed automatically. This is why speed became such a dangerous weapon. Not because it surprised the enemy, but because it rendered his actions irrelevant. German commanders could still inflict damage. They could still cause casualties, but they could no longer meaningfully slow the advance. The war had moved beyond the point where disruption at the tactical level could alter the operational outcome. Every hour that construction continued under fire widened the gap. Every vehicle that crossed increased Allied strength east of the river. Every additional crossing multiplied the problem. The Americans were not trying to win individual engagements at the river. They were trying to overwhelm German decision-making. And it worked. The Rhine became saturated with activity. Multiple crossings, multiple bridgeheads, continuous traffic. German forces were forced to respond everywhere at once with resources that were already depleted. There was no single point of failure left to exploit. This is the moment where the war stopped being about maneuver and became about capacity. Germany no longer lacked courage. It lacked throughput. American doctrine did not require elegance. It did not require beauty or permanence. The bridges bounced. They flexed. They leaked. They required constant attention. But they worked long enough to do what mattered. And that was enough. The idea of replacement extended beyond equipment. It applied to people as well. Units rotated. Wounded were evacuated. Fresh engineers arrived. The system assumed that losses would occur and planned for them accordingly. This is why German efforts to target individuals, commanders, specialists, key units had diminishing returns. Removing one part of the system did not disable the system. It simply triggered substitution. In contrast, German systems were brittle. Their defenses depended on fixed positions, limited resources, and highly trained specialists. Once disrupted, they could not easily recover. Losses accumulated faster than they could be replaced. The system degraded over time. The Rhine crossings accelerated this imbalance. Each successful crossing increased Allied pressure across a widening front. German units east of the river faced not only advancing troops, but the certainty that more were coming, and that there was no reliable way to stop them. The war was no longer about holding ground. It was about being buried under volume. This is the part of the story that makes the outcome feel inevitable in retrospect. Once the Americans demonstrated that they could build bridges faster than Germany could destroy them, the strategic problem was solved. The specific details no longer mattered. Which bridge? Which unit? Which crossing point? The system would win regardless. Speed, in this sense, was not an attribute. It was a property of the system itself. A system optimized for replacement will always outrun one optimized for denial. Germany was fighting to prevent something from happening. America was fighting to make something happen repeatedly. Those goals are not symmetrical. The Rhine exposed that asymmetry with brutal clarity. By mid-March 1945, it was no longer possible to argue that the crossings were lucky, improvised, or exceptional. They were repeatable, predictable, scalable, and that is what terrified the defenders. Because once a process becomes repeatable, it becomes unstoppable. The bridges did not need to last. They only needed to appear. And as long as they kept appearing faster than they could be destroyed, the war on the Western Front had already been decided. Germany had destroyed the bridges. America had replaced the logic behind them. Moment in every collapsing defense when resistance does not end suddenly, but quietly loses its purpose. For Germany, that moment came when the Rhine stopped behaving like a river that needed to be crossed and started behaving like a space that could no longer be controlled. By mid-March 1945, the question facing German commanders was no longer how to stop the Allies at the Rhine. That question had already been answered, and the answer was that they could not. The real question had become something far more dangerous. How many crossings were already happening, and how many more were coming? The destruction of permanent bridges had been meant to simplify the battlefield. Fewer crossings meant fewer threats. Fewer threats meant concentrated fire, predictable targets, and manageable defense. Instead, the opposite occurred. Without fixed bridges, there were no fixed points to defend. Temporary crossings appeared at multiple locations, often simultaneously. Some lasted hours, some lasted days. Some were damaged and repaired. Others were abandoned and replaced somewhere else. The river was no longer defined by bridges, it was defined by activity. The Rhine had turned into a construction zone. For German forces, this was operational chaos. Defensive plans depended on knowing where the enemy would cross. Artillery deployments depended on predictable approach routes. Air attacks depended on timing and visibility. All of that broke down once crossings became fluid. There was no longer a single decisive crossing to stop. There were many, and they kept multiplying. Each successful bridgehead on the eastern bank changed the balance of power. Artillery crossed, tanks followed, supply lines stabilized. What had begun as temporary footholds hardened into permanent positions, not because the bridges lasted, but because the troops did. Once enough men and equipment crossed, the river ceased to matter. The Rhine did not need to be fully bridged. It only needed to be crossed often enough, in enough places, to overwhelm German defenses east of the river. And that threshold was reached far faster than German planners had anticipated. The collapse was not dramatic. There was no single catastrophic failure. There was no moment when German defenses simply gave way. Instead, there was a steady erosion of relevance. Every bridge destroyed was replaced by two more. Every artillery strike damaged something that could be repaired. Every delay bought less time than the last. The German defensive strategy depended on scarcity. Scarcity of time, scarcity of crossings, scarcity of opportunities for the attacker. Once that scarcity vanished, the strategy unraveled. The Rhine was still wide. The Rhine was still cold. The Rhine was still dangerous. But it was no longer decisive. American forces east of the river began operating with growing confidence. Supply convoys moved continuously. Ammunition dumps appeared. Field hospitals followed. What had been expected to be a fragile bridgehead turned into a logistical base. German units found themselves fighting an enemy who was no longer constrained by the river behind him. The Allies were no longer attacking across a boundary. They were advancing from within Germany itself. This had psychological consequences as well. The Rhine had been presented as the final line. Soldiers were told that once the Allies reached it, the worst was over, that the river would slow the enemy, that the war inside Germany would be fought on German terms. When that promise collapsed, morale collapsed with it. German troops east of the Rhine were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The enemy had not been delayed. He had not been weakened. He had not been slowed. He was accelerating. Every hour that passed brought more Allied forces across. Every day expanded the bridgeheads. German counterattacks became increasingly desperate and increasingly futile. They were thrown against positions that were already being resupplied faster than they could be threatened. The Rhine crossings did not merely enable the Allied advance. They reshaped the battlefield faster than German command structures could adapt. Orders became outdated almost as soon as they were issued. Defensive lines planned around river barriers lost their meaning. Units were repositioned to counter crossings that were no longer the main effort. Germans were reacting to shadows. What had begun as a strategy of denial ended as a struggle against saturation. This is where the true collapse occurred. Not at the riverbank, not at the bridge, but in the logic of defense itself. Germany had prepared to defend against an enemy that needed permission to cross. An enemy that required time, space, and fixed infrastructure. But the enemy that arrived at the Rhine needed none of those things. The Americans did not need Germany's bridges. They did not need to preserve the river. They did not need to slow down. They only needed to keep building. As the Rhine filled with crossings, the illusion of control disappeared. German commanders could no longer meaningfully predict where the next bridge would appear or how long it would last. The river stopped being a line and became a blur. And once that happened, the defensive value of the Rhine evaporated. The last natural barrier in Western Germany had been neutralized, not by overwhelming firepower, but by relentless repetition. By treating the river not as an obstacle to overcome once, but as a process to be exploited continuously. Germany had destroyed its bridges to create a pause. Instead, it created momentum. By the time the full implications were clear, the outcome was already set. The Rhine was no longer holding back the invasion. It was feeding it. And what lay beyond the river was no longer a prepared defense, but the open interior of a collapsing state. The bridges did not fall. The idea behind them did. Historians describe the end of the war in Western Europe they often focus on the final battles. The encirclement of German armies, the collapse of resistance, the surrender that followed weeks later. But by the time those events unfolded, the outcome had already been decided. It was decided at the Rhine, not because of a single bridge, not because of a single crossing, but because of a misunderstanding about what kind of war was being fought. Germany believed it was fighting a war of denial. Destroy infrastructure, remove access, force delay, make the enemy pay for every mile. That approach had worked in earlier wars, and even earlier phases of this one. But the war that reached the Rhine in 1945 was no longer governed by denial. It was governed by replacement. The Americans did not approach the Rhine asking how to preserve bridges. They approached it asking how to manufacture crossings. They did not care whether a bridge survived the war. They only cared whether it survived long enough. This distinction made all the difference. Germany destroyed bridges, assuming the Allies would need them. That assumption framed every defensive calculation. It justified the demolition of infrastructure. It justified the belief that time could still be bought. What Germany failed to grasp was that the Allies had already solved the problem that destruction was meant to create. They had solved it years earlier, not on the battlefield, but in factories, training manuals, and doctrine. They had accepted that bridges would be destroyed and designed systems that functioned anyway. By the time German charges detonated along the Rhine, the answer to the problem of crossing had already been manufactured, packed onto trucks, and distributed to units trained to deploy it without hesitation. The river was not a surprise. The demolitions were not unexpected. The resistance was not underestimated. Everything the Germans did at the Rhine made sense if the enemy still played by the old rules. But the rules had changed. The Rhine crossings revealed a deeper truth about modern warfare. Victory no longer depended on preventing the enemy from acting. It depended on whether you could act faster than the enemy could react. Germany reacted to bridges by destroying them. America reacted to destruction by replacing it. Those reactions were not equal. One approach exhausted itself. The other scaled. The German war effort in 1945 was already constrained by scarcity. Scarcity of fuel, scarcity of trained manpower, scarcity of time. Every demolition consumed resources that could not be easily replaced. Every delay achieved less than the one before. American war-making assumed abundance. Not infinite abundance, but sufficient depth to sustain momentum. Equipment was standardized. Personnel were trained to operate systems rather than improvise solutions. Losses were tragic, but expected and planned for. This difference meant that the longer the process continued, the more inevitable the outcome became. The Rhine did not stop the invasion because the invasion no longer needed stopping. It needed feeding. Once crossings were established, the American advance no longer depended on breakthroughs. It depended on flow. Flow of vehicles, flow of fuel, flow of replacements. And that flow only increased. Germany's final defensive line collapsed not because it was weak, but because it was irrelevant. A river can only delay an enemy who must pause to cross it. It cannot stop an enemy who turns crossing into routine. This is why the destruction of the Rhine bridges stands as one of the great strategic ironies of the war. Germany destroyed its own infrastructure to deny it to the enemy, only to discover that the enemy did not need it at all. The act that was supposed to slow the invasion instead accelerated it by forcing a confrontation between two fundamentally different systems. One system was built to obstruct. The other was built to replace. Once those systems met, the outcome was never in doubt. The Rhine was not conquered by brilliance or daring. It was neutralized by process, by repetition, by the relentless application of industrial logic to a military problem. The bridges that crossed it were crude, temporary, imperfect. They flexed under weight, they leaked, they required constant maintenance. Never appear in peacetime engineering textbooks as examples of elegance. But they did not need to be elegant. They needed to exist. Long enough for tanks to cross. Long enough for supply lines to form. Long enough for the war to move past the river and never look back. By the time Germany surrendered weeks later, the Rhine was already history. Its role as a barrier had ended the moment the first temporary bridge carried vehicles into the Reich faster than it could be destroyed. The lesson of the Rhine is not about bridges. It is about what happens when industrial capacity stops supporting war and starts shaping it. When production replaces preservation. When systems are designed not to avoid failure, but to outpace it. Germany fought a war where denial was the ultimate defense. America fought a war where replacement was the ultimate offense. At the Rhine, those philosophies collided. Germany destroyed every bridge. America crossed faster than they could destroy them. And in that single fact lies the reason the war in the West ended when it did. World War II wasn't decided only on battlefields. It was decided in systems that replaced losses faster than enemies could cause them. If you want more documentaries that expose the hidden logic behind history's biggest events, subscribe and continue the journey with us.